I decided to cast a talk that is not going to fully talk about my research program, just a little bit of it. And I'm going to sort of make a transition to address some environmental policy issues relevant to Canada. The reason for doing that is the prize I won, and for which I have the pleasure to be here today, is a prize that recognizes an ecologist that used science for resolving an environmental issue. And I did actually put on that slide the medal of Mr. Romanowski. He was a French meteorologist who moved to Canada, and he was a firm believer in the responsibility that scientists had to inform public policy. So that was why I casted my talk in this context. So what is the sort of common thread throughout my career is climate change. You don't necessarily need to look at the numbers in white. They are the collective emissions reduction commitment that we have on the table now. And one of the undergrad in my lab, he estimated with this level of ambition, what the governments of the world are saying they're going to do about climate change. We should, in 2100, have an atmospheric carbon dioxide concentration of above 550 ppm. When I did my PhD, I worked on photosynthesis. That's probably what got me involved in that bandwagon, because that's a little instrument that measures the atmospheric CO2 concentration. And we saw that going up year after year. And when I was a grad student, we were at about 368. So we've gone a long way. Last week, the IPCC report said we are at 390. And the modeled possible increase that would go with this increase in carbon dioxide is roughly about 3 degrees Celsius. So a future world might look like that, making some happy and others least happy. So by a series of coincidences and facts of life, I had the pleasure and honor to become a negotiator in the Climate Change Convention. That is, I was sitting there in front of Brazil and the US, speaking on behalf of Panama. And that picture has been taken the night where the agreement of climate change fell through in 2009 in Copenhagen. So that's a very missed meeting with history for the world. That's why we ended up talking about Fehlenhagen. And the reason why I became involved in this international negotiation is that one possible way to mitigate climate change is to reduce deforestation in the tropics. So this agenda item that Dr. Yates mentioned is reducing emissions from deforestation and forest degradation, and the acronym that will come throughout my talk is RED. I actually liked RED because it seemed like a positive things you could do, okay? The idea is you would take money from developed country and give that money to developing country, and with that money and technical assistance, developing country would curtail or stop deforestation. This became really popular, and the best proof that I can have to show you how popular it is that there is close to $4 billion on the table from a donor viewpoint nowadays to combat deforestation. So if you were a forest ecologist, this is a mind-boggling amount of money. We never get so much money for forest ecology. So there's something behind this. Okay, half of the weight of a tree is carbon. Okay, globally, the most recent estimate are that about 12% of emissions come from deforestation in the tropics. In 2007, Her Majesty the Queen appointed Sir Nicholas Stern, a very well-known British economist, to publish a report. She mandated him to do a report on the economy of climate change. And one of the conclusions of this report was that the most cost-effective way to reduce emissions on a global planetary basis would be to reduce deforestation. Okay? So that attracted a lot of interest from developed countries because they could see that maybe emissions could be reduced without them having to do much else than give money. That is not changing their lifestyle. So the idea of RED is to calculate emissions in the north and compensate those emissions by avoiding emissions due to deforestation, right? So for the system to work, we need to know how much carbon dioxide is avoided in the south to make sure that we have a balanced system in terms of carbon, and then there's a transaction of money. So my role obviously is not with the money part. My role is looking at the emissions, and I work mostly in Panama, so that's a country in Central America, bordering Colombia and Costa Rica. A large, before I get into this, in all my slides, sometimes the little picture here change to show my grad student, not those one, but this one. She was a PhD student in my lab, now doing a postdoc at the Woods Hole Research Center. So it allows to give credit because, of course, people my age, we talk about the research we do, but in fact, we don't do very much. It's all our students who do the work, right? So Joanne, what she did start to do is to try and understand how much uncertainty do we have when we are saying emissions from deforestation are this much, okay? So put an error bar around that number. And that error bar is very important, again, because that number, the emissions from deforestation, is something we pay for now in a carbon market. So to do this, we actually had access, which is fairly unique to the original data of Panama. So Panama opened their book and they said, this is what we have, okay? So with the real data of a real country, we were able to estimate the emissions around deforestation. So let me walk you through this. There are really two flip sides of the coin when we're trying to assess emissions from deforestation. On one hand, we need to know how much forest is being lost. That's an area basis, okay? So we need to know what's the coverage, the surface of forest loss. And in the IPCC jargon, we talk about activity data. So here is an illustration of the sort of problem we found for Panama. To calculate its baseline of emission, Panama relied on two maps of forest cover, 1992 and 2000, and they subtract the amount of forest loss between those two dates. But when we go back to the original data that were used to produce this map, we see that it was in fact a mosaic of satellite images coming from different time. And it's not because Panama is sloppy. Simply in the tropics, there's a lot of clouds. So on some years, it's impossible to get a good idea of a portion of the country, say here. But what is the consequence? If you're going to superpose two images, and you're saying this is 1992, but you're seeing we have data from 1989, 88, the time interval is not going to be the same. And that creates a form of error. So one part of the work we've been doing is to quantify and analyze the importance of these sorts of error. The other flip side of the coin when we're talking about emissions is what we call the emission factor, that is, how many carbon is there in 1 hectare of forest. In theory, it's simple. Half of the weight of a tree is carbon. So let's go in the forest, let's cut the forest, and let's weigh it. Well, of course, we're not going to do that. It's fairly counterproductive, besides the fact that it's complicated. The forests in Panama are about 40 to 50 meters tall. So we use allometric equations. We measure the diameter of tree and their height. We put that in a mathematical model, and we estimate the carbon stock. So have a look at these two equations, the blue and green. This is exactly the same trees, the same forest, the same plot, with data inputted in two different, well-accepted, totally reputable, published in peer literature data. So a huge difference. We get either 250 megagram of carbon per hectare versus 169. Overall, this is the default value of IPCC. So we have a 2.5 difference, order of magnitude difference in the estimates of carbon stock, and again, using perfectly acceptable state-of-the-art standard. Well, is it important? What we did is to do the same kind of analysis with as many as possible sources of error that we could imagine. Okay, for example, the snapshot effect is saying, if I'm looking at a map in 1992 and 2000, and I'm saying this is a forest that regrew, well, maybe there was a life cycle during that time. It's possible the forest grew and was cut back and grew again. So we don't really know this unless we have yearly data. So again, we did this sort of analysis of all the existing error, and we really found that the mature forest carbon stock is our most important source of error. And I'll go back to that because it's been an important result that determines a lot of the research I'm doing now. So 50% of the error is due to measuring the carbon density in a 1 hectare of a forest. For Panama, it has dramatic implication. So on this graph, many lines, the blue lines is a confidence interval. Okay, so they determine the error around any number, emissions here, of carbon dioxide through time. So this is a scenario modeling future land use change in Panama as a result of policy implementation and trying to say, can Panama claim emissions reduction given the error that plagues the estimate? So in red, this is my baseline scenario, how emissions would progress in Panama under the current land use scenario, right? With, in blue, its confidence interval. Well, this line here, it represents 50% reduction in deforestation in the country. That is an enormous effort. It's very difficult to reduce 50% of deforestation. And you can see that even if efforts are starting right now, it's going to take 20 years before Panama could claim that this effort gets out of the error bar around the current scenario. So basically, errors are so great around our emissions estimate that they have little to no meaning really scientifically. So scientists are thinking more and more that we have to do a revolution in the way we're measuring forest carbon, and we have to go to another types of tools. There are many, but one of the tools that is apparently very promising is to use a LIDAR sensor, airborne LIDAR. So LIDAR really sends a laser beam down, and as illustrated here, on the airplane you have a sensor, and you can measure the time it takes for your laser beam to hit the ground and come back to the airplane. But if your plane flies over a forest, it will come back more rapidly to the airplane, right? So you can measure the difference in time between hitting a tree and hitting the ground. And that will allow you to reconstruct the height of a forest and its three-dimensional structure. So there's a scientist with whom we teamed, Dr. Greg Asner, who is here on this picture. He is from Stanford University at the Carnegie at the Carnegie Institute, and he created what he calls the Carnegie Airborne Observatory. The Carnegie Airborne Observatory was convinced to come to work in Panama by the Smithsonian Tropical Research Institute. They are a McGill partner in Panama, and they are the host institution when I get there. So we actually got the plane of Dr. Asner to come to Panama and fly over the whole country to actually get carbon data in another way. So this just gives you an example of what the plane did. The plane actually flew transect. The transect were made perpendicular to the main mountain chain. So there's a mountain chain in Panama, so that it would sample across ecosystem. So we had long discussions and decided that was the best way. So where you have a red line here, these are real observed data. And then using some maths, these data observed can be related to satellite imagery to do extrapolation. And that allows to create a map of carbon density for the whole country. So in this map, again, this map is the result of a modeling, but coming with a lot more direct observation made by the plane than what we can do underground. Okay, this plane probably sampled about 3% of the surface of Panama, which is about 100 times more than the best forest inventory could do. I want to attract your attention to these color patches on this. So this is eastern Panama. So Panama City is about here. So this is the eastern part of the country. And all of these colored surfaces, they are indigenous territories. Okay, so the plane flew over these indigenous territories. And if you can, sort of match what you're seeing here with the full map, you will see that the dark red, which represent the high carbon area, actually more or less geographically coincide with indigenous area. So if technology is good with me, I will show you now what was my role in this project. In the context of climate change, there is this huge interest to stop deforestation. And again, if indigenous people in Panama, they control 60% of primary forests, they will be key actors for this, agenda of conserving the forest. So about 3 years ago, we started a large program of training of technicians, indigenous chiefs and technicians on this proposal. It's a big territory, 200,000 hectares.
Sí. Suena bien.
Last year, a scientist from California, Dr. Greg Asner, he flew over this landscape with a plane, and he measured carbon with what we scientists consider probably one of the most advanced technology.
Cada equipo tiene flagging tape, cada equipo tiene la cinta diamétrica y una wincha. Entonces, jefe de equipo, tú agregas tu cosa y tú lo distribuyes a tu gente.
So we're currently establishing the line along a plot of 1 hectare that correspond exactly to 1 hectare that has been measured by the LIDAR plane, because we want to validate the data of the LIDAR with the people from the community, because for them, in order to actually believe that this plane that takes data from the sky is taking data that are meaningful, they really need to see a part of that for themselves. And then within that forest, measure the height of trees and their diameter, as well as the species identification.
55.8.
These are the 3 elements that we actually need to estimate the carbon, the above ground carbon stock, as we say it.
64.1. Altura.
We're sort of acting as a bridge between this really high-tech technology and their belief system and their understanding of their own, forested landscape. So the reason why I was actually in the forest there was because it was a sort of a verification for the technicians. We had trained the technicians, and I went to make sure that, the numbers that they understood the technique well, and then I didn't go back. So it was really fun, because they are the people that actually went on their own territory, measured the carbon to then say, hey, is this guy from Stanford doing a good job or not? Which I'm not going to give the answer today. But I'm going to show you some of the data and something that's very exciting for me. I don't think there's any forest biologist in the room, but we had a really very impressive surprise when we started to analyze the data. So these are, the carbon on the y-axis. So that's the carbon value for our, the trees, the plots that were measured in that expedition that you saw. In yellow here, these are plots that had been used for selective logging. So we can see it very well. They have depressed carbon number, not so many big trees. That's expected. But what came as a surprise is this line in yellow. It shows the average carbon stock of what we had considered previously as the perfect, pristine forest for Panama. And you can see that we found many, many plots with way more carbon than what we had considered previously as, what is a pristine forest. So we are actually thinking that the forests where we were are the real primary forest. And the forest we've always been considering as the primary forest, in fact, is probably a very old, 300 years old secondary forest. So we're still trying to figure that out and verifying our measurement, but that certainly, made us very excited. This is one of the steps we've taken to see are we daydreaming or not. So this is a real image coming out of the LIDAR. So all of this, it looks like a broccoli. It's really the forest seen from above, okay? And in red, you have the trees that are taller than 50 meters. And in this square here, to give you a sense of scale, this is 1 hectare. And in that forest that has always been considered as Panama's typical pristine forest, there's a single tree bigger than 50 meters. So look at this. So we really are like onto something. And I think a part of that is, again, having been allowed into this indigenous territory to say, okay, is this plane lying, is how we were saying. Is this plane lying or is it true? So it's a fairly interesting question for me, and that's a lot of my future research immediately on the biology side of things. I'm going to switch now to people, because it's one thing to measure carbon, try find new ways to engage people in all of that. That's good, that's important. It's to reduce the uncertainty around emissions. But the real question, if this red policy measure is adopted, is will it be good for people? Will it actually improve their livelihood? Will they gain something from that? We had somebody at the discussion group with grad student earlier that, was asking a lot of questions along those lines. So in my group, we work with what we call participatory method. Just like you've seen, the carbon measurements are done by local indigenous people. All of the work we do is done by the people, and we sort of supervise them and train them so that they actually, do the work, and they're fully part of the research endeavor. So working with one community in particular, this data is from a community in particular. They control about 3,000 hectares, and they're very interested in the carbon market. We reconstructed in red here how forest has been lost through time on their territory. And this is their sense of what the forest would look like in 2020 if nothing is done, and if they keep their acting on the landscape as usual. So basically, if we transform the surface area into emissions or in carbon stock, in 20 years, they would lose about 50% of their carbon. So these are really forests that are threatened by destruction. So the director of the Smithsonian Tropical Institute, Dr. Eldridge Birmingham, decided that his institute would become carbon neutral. I think he was helped in this decision by the fact that they received some funds from the HSBC, and this bank promotes to have partners that are carbon neutral. So how do we become carbon neutral when we're in an institution? Well, you do a carbon budget, so how much carbon are you emitting? And then you see what can you reduce through air condition, transportation, etc. And then you can buy offset. And that's what the Smithsonian did with this village. So they struck a deal to develop a pilot project in which they would be paying for reforestation and they would be paying for avoiding deforestation. And that was really cool because it was sort of bringing into action theory, okay, and seeing would that work, what are the challenges. So when we discussed with the villagers, I'm not going to talk about the reforestation part, just the red part, the avoiding deforestation. The villagers had a great plan. They said, okay, we're going to avoid deforestation in this zone, which is the one where deforestation has been going on. And to prevent deforestation, we're going to post a big sign in front of the forest, several signs, in fact. We're going to plant a buffer zone of trees, agroforestry trees, trees that produce fruits to bring an income. And we're going to train park rangers that will be charged to patrolling. So we start on all of this. We get the signs up. They're beautiful. I'm happy. This is the logo of the Ministry of Environment of Panama, who, you know, to give it a more strength. We start to train the local ranger, and we go back to the field after 2 months. And this is what it looks like. So I don't know if you can appreciate that it's not especially a pristine forest that I have behind my sign. And it is not because we are so dumb that we've put the sign in front of a destroyed forest. No, when we put the sign, it was in front of a forest. And we came back, and it's not a forest anymore. And so we go, oh, what's going on? So we had been working on, you know, in social science, they talk of sustainable livelihoods approaches, like looking at how you can give, you know, a different livelihood approach to bring income to the community, making the mistake that this community was living in a vacuum, not paying any attention to the neighbors of that community. That community actually, in quote, controlled 3,000 hectares. Well, control, not so much. Because this was really our reality. The reality was that the neighbors, colonist farmers, wanted land to put their cows. And they saw this cool forest that was just idle, doing nothing, being unproductive, nothing, you know, transforming it into a pasture. So it's the neighbors that actually came in and nibbled until on the forest that we were protecting. And they were quite not very impressed by our sign and by the presence of the Ministry of Environment in this. So that had us kind of moved research target from strictly considering the landscape to be owned and managed by indigenous people to consider the other part of this landscape, which are the migrant, the colonist farmers. In Panama, they come from Western Panama, and they actually moved to Eastern Panama, and on this map, the red is deforestation. So they moved to Eastern Panama to get land. In Latin America, except Mexico, in general, if you are landless and you cut a forest and make it productive by planting corn or putting a cow, then the forest belongs to you. So these people are poor people, and they really are searching to better off their livelihoods. And to do that, they need to find a piece of forest. So one of my master's students started to work with colonist farmers to try and understand their desire, what they want in life, what's their vision of the future. And it was important for us to realize that what they were telling us is we do what we know. And what we know is cut a forest, set it to burn, and put a cow on it. Okay? And it's actually a very good livelihood strategy, you know. We were having discussion with them and think about telling a colonist farmer, do a reforestation project. You put a tree. It takes 25 years before you can cut this tree, sell this tree, and make money. So what if your wife becomes sick? What if you want to send your kids to school? You can't cut this tree, you have to wait 25 years. If you put 2 cows, eventually you have 4 and 5, and it grows, and you can sell some, and other babies will come. So there, you know, it's a much more flexible asset than a forest. So on the landscape where we have really contrasting worldview. I hope you can see this picture even in the back row, because to me it illustrates. In French we say une image vaut 1000 mots. One image is worth 1,000 words. This is indigenous land. This is colonist land. The same land, the same topographical feature, completely different fate, okay? And so the work that we then realized we had to do is not only protect a forest, find an income, find alternative livelihoods, but it's really to find an equilibrium between these different worldviews. So indigenous people, they're very important in all of the research that we do in my lab, and I'm going to try and convince you that it's a good investment. So Gerardo, one of my PhD students, for part of his dissertation, he actually looked at forest cover changes inside indigenous territories of Panama. So this is Panama, and in green you have the forest. In this slide, we are in 1992, the beginning of this kind of baseline period for the country of Panama. And what Gerardo did is he mapped in blue indigenous territories. In Panama, 20% of the countries is already settled land claim. And there is 10% additional land claim that are being negotiated. That's a huge amount of land, okay? So concentrate in looking at this zone here, okay? This is the zone where I work, and it's a zone where we have land that is not from indigenous and land that we have that is managed by indigenous people. So 1992, 2000, 2008, okay? So with this, we were actually able to quantify the protection factor that indigenous people bring to the landscape of Panama, and that certainly makes them the key actor in this red debate, okay? They are the people who, by their livelihoods, are able to maintain the forest on the land. So the story that we've been building in Panama became more and more complicated. So we started with a community. We looked for somebody to buy carbon, strategy for making the people less poor. We thought we had it. Then we realized that the neighbors were coming in, so we started to look at alternative conflict resolution. But we've now realized we also need policies. We also need the state to be guiding all of that, okay? For example, the state of Panama doesn't recognize in the registry when you buy a piece of land. They don't recognize the indigenous land, even if they're legally recognized. In the registry, if you've bought a piece of land, or you claim that you've bought a piece of land inside an indigenous land, you go to the registry, there is nothing there that will prevent you from registering that you bought, okay? So there is a series of problems in the architecture of the policy of the country that we can't overcome. So we're now working with the government. We've created an advisory board that is intersectorial, in which we have everything: Catholic Church, the police, the private sector, the government, the indigenous people, the campesinos, the farmers, and we sit all of these people at the table, and we're trying to find commonly a resolution for that will involve the government. The government must actually come to the table of this. And so I've made this, I've added this, this illustration to say our understanding now is the analogy of a chain. A chain is as strong as its weakest link. So we started to work with one link, then two. But in fact, we just have to work with everybody at all levels if we want to have a real impact. And the context of Panama is that it's really not the forest that is a resource. So that was a misconception on my part. It is land, okay? Land, because for colonics farmer, this means a future and an agriculture. So we're now having this project that is funded by the Margaret Cargill Foundation, and we're trying to do three things. We're working at agricultural production, oil palm, and sustainable agriculture, trying to model on the landscape and see where we can go. We're actively engaged in conflict resolution because we're working with people that, basically one of our coordinators was almost burned alive by the other coordinator a few years back. So we're trying to, kind of set peace as a goal for a good development. And we found that to do that, we had one thing in common, is everybody is preoccupied by their youth. And the youth are not interested by agriculture, nor are they very much interested by forest conservation. So we brought to Panama, maybe some of you have heard of La Wapikoni Mobile. This is a studio of film that is training indigenous people in Quebec and also now in Canada. It's in Quebec, it is a group that fights against the suicide of young people. And they're training them to become filmmaker as a way to give them a voice. And so we are now making film in Panama with our young people, and it's fantastic because we're doing that with the three ethnic groups that exist in the region collaborating on making the same film. So it's a bit far away from being a biologist, but it's interesting. So you remember that my context is climate change, reducing deforestation as a mitigation tool. So Panama is just a small, tiny little country. But I hope that walking you through my research, I convinced you that when Sir Nicholas Stern, sitting in his office in London, said it's the cheapest and simplest way to reduce emissions, maybe for him, but maybe not for Panama. So obviously, if we're stepping back for a global context, it's Brazil that everybody has in mind. And Brazil is the single largest emitter of emissions, or was the single largest emitter of emissions from the deforestation. And in 2009, in Copenhagen, President Lula, he took the engagement to reduce deforestation by 80% for the whole country in 2020. Very ambitious target, Brazil. And this has been published, this figure comes from The Economist. It's not coming from the Greenpeace site. It's coming from The Economist of the 14th of September. In little square, you see deforestation from 2004 till 2012. I think that speaks for itself. Brazil has been tremendously successful at tackling this enormously complicated problem of deforestation. I find that amazingly inspiring. If you're interested, they have a national program, it's called PRODES, and it puts monthly deforestation rate on the web, so people could actually see what's going on almost in real time in the Amazon. So I find that really, really inspiring. Something else that I find very interesting, and I'm sorry that it's in French, I forgot to translate that. It's what's going on in Ecuador. So Ecuador changed the constitution. So we know in Canada, it's hard to play with constitution. So believe me, it's not a small feat. And in Article 71 of the new constitution, and that slide comes from, I was given to me by a lawyer that works in the Supreme Court of Ecuador. The Constitution of Ecuador is now giving rights to, and in the Constitution it says La Pachamama, or nature, Mother Nature, okay? Giving real rights to Pachamama. And then the lawyers, they had all this discussion about how can we give rights to Pachamama. Pachamama will not walk in front of the court saying they're walking on my feet. So they decided to take the analogy of children. Many countries give rights to children, but children don't go to court to defend their rights. So they've created a mediator that's a curator for nature, just like for old people or children, whose legal mandate is to go in front of the Supreme Court, defend the rights of nature. And in the Constitution, they have made every citizen of Ecuador responsible for defending the rights of Mother Nature on her behalf, just like we are for children. Interesting, right? Very, very interesting. This used to be, with Brazil, the most exciting novelty in the world of deforestation, and it's changed last month. So in Ecuador, there's a national park, because of course, you know, you say, okay, yes, they changed their constitution, but it won't lead to any action. Well, Presidente Garcia, he started what we call the Yasuni Initiative. Yasuni is in a national park. This national park sits over an enormous amount of oil. Yasuni is the most diverse forest we know in the world. There is more species of trees in 1 hectare of forest of Yasuni than all of North America together. Mind-boggling diversity, sitting over oil. So President Garcia said, okay guys, we're not going to extract this oil, we're just going to leave it underneath. And he went to a referendum on that. And 78% of people in Ecuador backed the president, saying we're not going to get the oil. It's better underground. Amazing, isn't it? By doing that, then they were foregoing about $7 billion of income. So after saying we're not going to extract the oil, President Garcia, he did organize the fund in the context of UNDP, and he asked the world to contribute half of the income. He said, for us, not a rich country, to be able to make that, we need your help. The RED program exists. If you give us half of the income, we Ecuadorian, we will take the other half and carry it on our shoulder. Unfortunately, in 4 years, he did not receive money. And last month, he announced that he was closing this and they would go forward on drilling. Interestingly, people were all over the street protesting, saying, no, no, we don't want the oil, even if we don't have the money. So it remains to be seen what will happen. But a lot of courage, isn't it? It's fun. Maybe some of you wonder where I'm going. Well, I'm coming back home. That's actually what I'm doing in my own career now. I'm sort of coming back home. Canada, this is the emissions of the country that emit a lot of greenhouse gases. And Canada, yes, we are this tiny, insignificant 3% of global emissions. So who cares what we do? Is that true? Well, you can always look at things in different ways in science, right? But look at this graph. This is emission per capita. So if you look at emissions per capita, Canadian and US citizen, we are the villain of the film because we have the highest emission rate per capita, and that's all of us. So what is our ambition? We've seen that of Brazil, we've seen attempts in Ecuador, So what is our ambition in Canada? It's complicated. People have difficulty understanding, where Canada stands on that. So let's try and reconstruct this. When the Kyoto Protocol was negotiated and when Canada was part of the Protocol of Kyoto, the developed country in the world, amongst themselves, agreed to use 1990 as their reference emission level for all the developed countries and to reduce from that. So the target for Canada, the Kyoto target, was 6% reduction of 1990, and this is here, and it's also the red line, okay? So that was our target under Kyoto. Prime Minister Harper walked out of Kyoto, so we're not binded by this anymore, but nevertheless, Prime Minister Harper hasn't walked out of the Convention of Climate Change. And the Convention of Climate Change is negotiating new targets for all countries, including Canada. And the deadline or the end point or the future next big negotiation will be December 2015. Here is the position of Canada now. Our current target, if you read government documents, say we will reduce of 17%, which looks better than 6, but of 2005, which is not to 1990. So here is 2005 and here is 1990. So basically now we're having a reduction proposed of 17% of 2005, which is this, which is way higher than the original reduction that we had at some point based on Kyoto. So we do have a reduction emission target, but not a very ambitious one. So how do we compare to others? I like to talk about Norway because, like Canada, it is a petroleum production country. So Norway has adopted a reduction of 30% of 1990, so no game playing of coming back sooner because our emissions have gone higher. But besides that, Norway decided that they will be carbon neutral in 2030. So what are they doing? They're saying we really have to extract oil. This is important to our economy. And we are actively investing in alternative sources of energy. We're taking the revenue from oil to fuel a new industry, an industry of knowledge, an industry that will allow us to wean ourselves from petroleum. Very interesting thinking, okay? So other countries, UK, also aiming to have very substantial emissions, and if you look at their pattern, these countries are dropping their emissions. By doing that, obviously, they are creating know-how in their country on technology. To me, it's been shocking. Last spring, I had a technician working in Quebec, measuring trees in the forest, and there was a windmill, and the technicians came from Germany. How can it be that in Quebec we don't have the knowledge to have our windmill functioning? Somehow, maybe we're not investing where we should. So how do we go about reduction? Well, we should first look at where do we emit. So here are our emission sectors. So we have transport with 24% and oil and gas with 23%. So if you want to reduce, we should try and target these things. What's interesting about transport, it is not transport between cities. 76% of this pie is transport inside the cities. That's, we have a handle on that. And, here you have those street cars, we have the bikes. We are able to do this. It's not that Canada is so big that we can't resolve that. We can do this. This is within reach. And then there's no traffic jam. I was stuck in one coming here, actually, and it was 10 o'clock. So it's nice to be in Ontario and criticize Quebec. I'm sure you prefer that than me being in Ontario criticizing Ontario. Besides, I don't know Ontario. So let me criticize Quebec a little bit. Because in Quebec, of course, we do things the way we do things. So we have an emissions reduction target that is way more ambitious than Canada. We took that of Europe. So our emission reduction target in Quebec is minus 20% of 1990, just like Europe. And that is a law now. It was largely a consensus of society. So we've estimated with my lab that to reach this, we need to reduce 11 million tons per year. We're 8 million, so each one of us, we need to reduce 1.5 a ton, more or less. But then the government of Quebec, it sees its future in developing mining in the north. Oh well. So we've also started a little exercise. The Plan Nord, which is the vision of the future for Quebec, is to promote 11 new mines up north. So we could find data for 8 of them. And for these 8 mines, we would add 3 megatons per year to be reduced to the burden of the Quebecois. Okay, so there seems to be a bit of a difficulty here of coherence. This is one of the mines that for which we've been doing some calculation, and we're working now trying to do that better. This is actually the single biggest iron deposit that exists in the world, I'm told. Then the mine is from India. So the proposal of the Quebec government is the the mineral will be extracted, will be put on ship, will be sent to India, will be processed to India, And of course, we're going to buy it from them. So I'm not sure, but when I was a high school student, I was told that Canada built its wealth on natural resources, and step one was the value added locally. So, you know, and in terms of emissions, it's hard to make sense of that. It's very hard. So there are many things we could do. For example, if a mine in the Plan Nord du Québec, we don't oblige the mine to use hydroelectricity. They can actually use diesel. Well, where we could say, if you want to mine, you have to be on hydro, emissions would drop tremendously. Currently, there is no regulation on how would all of that be transported, so they're going to build road everywhere. Well, you know, railroads would be much more efficient. And by the way, maybe having experience with railroad could then be transferred to other railroads that could improve the railroads that could reduce the transport. Transformation, I just mentioned, it seems a bit mind-boggling that we're going to take everything we have, ship it, increase our emissions, and not get any input from that. And then there is the idea of Norway. What are we doing with this investment, you know? Are we just getting rich for what? Or are we getting rich to invest in a future? And I'm also concerned with the rhythm. I told some people I'm a grandmother now, so that concerns me. I don't really see why we should take all the iron now. You know, my grandson might want to have some of that income as well. So I believe that we really have in Quebec and in Canada an exercise of coherence and, you know, and ways forward to start and do. And this is my last slide. It's sort of where I am now. Okay, so at McGill we are creating, and I don't have the logo yet, a new chair. It's a UNESCO, it's been approved by UNESCO. It's going to be called Dialogue on Sustainability. And my hope with that is to bring to the table, by province first or together, I don't know, but now I'm meeting people in different provinces, bring people together and say, okay, what can we do? Positive things. We can do a lot of things. You know, if Norway can do that, for sure we can do that. If Brazil can do that, for sure we can do this, okay? So trying to think forward for solutions. So I think reaching out is a part of that, and thanks to the great introduction, you already know I make all of these videos. By the way, you will be able to see why I'm blue in the film I showed you and these videos. And, you know, I really think that if we start to give publicity and voice to the positive action and everything that can be done, maybe we can defeat doom and gloom. And as academic, people in the world of academia, maybe we can infuse a sort of another direction to our country. Thank you.